I want to go ahead and move on to talk about, of course, our lecture today. Of course, one of the first things I will be talking about today is I'll wrap up talking about the period of the Spanish in the New World. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, of course, during the lecture, as I'm, of course, lecturing to y'all today. I first need to talk about what the Spanish viceroyalties are. I'm going to finish up the Spanish period here with this, and then I'll probably have a little review. And then I'm also going to cover a little bit on the Age of Absolutism as well. But previous class, we had, covered the conquistadors, how they had come into the Americas and began exploring and conquering it. And then over time, what happened was the Spanish divided up their conquests into various colonies, like royal colonies, which were given a nickname. They were called the Spanish viceroyalties. So they usually dub them plural. And these weren't just in the Americas. They were all over the world. Like I think they had the one in the Philippines was a viceroyalty. They had these in Europe, I think, as well. And the colonies were all run by these, what they call a viceroy. Viceroy is like I think it's on this slide, it's like a royal governor who basically were like the chief executives of a colony, and they were under the king. The king couldn't be there, in person. And so these royal governors were appointed personally to run the state and carry out the laws of the state that were there. So that's hence the name viceroy, viceroyalty, where it originally came from as a whole. You can see they divided, like at least the Spanish conquest, like in Latin America, into several viceroyalties. There was at least 4 of them, although early on there was only 2. Starting in the 16th century, they had New Spain, which was like part of North America and Mexico. That was considered the first one. Its capital was Mexico City, which was right here. And then he had Peru, which Peru was actually all the way down here originally, but Peru was like eventually like this area in dark green right here. And its main capital was Lima. So those were the 2 initial ones that they had. And then what happened was later by the, I think, 18th century, 1700s, they divided up the territories, the colonies, into 2 other viceroyalties. Viceroyalty of New Granada, which is right here. That included like Northern South America, where mostly Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela was right there. Now La Plata, which was down here, was the last one, Rio de la Plata. Of course, they called it the full name, named after the Plate River down here. And that would include like Argentina, predominantly, and also, I guess, Uruguay, Paraguay, I think Bolivia, which is somewhere around here, is kind of in it as well. So that's how they divided up their colonies. And the Spanish would control pretty much these parts of the New World up to like the early 1800s. The Spanish were in control of Latin America for several hundred years. So they had a major influence on the culture there. Of course, religion with Catholicism, and a lot of their governments and court systems are, heavily influenced by the Spanish. In fact, I did want to talk about some of the things like the Real Audiencia, which is right there. They call it different names, Real Audiencia or Audiencias. They also had the corregidors. I don't know if you ever heard of that. But those were both various court systems that were in the Spanish colonies. They were ruled by judges. And the audiencias were judicial consuls, kind of like high up, basically, like usually like in a capital city and or a major city. And it was called audiencia. The word audiencia meant audience. And so real audiencia meant royal audience. And so they would hear court cases, and then also the audiencias would also control a lot of the government as well in the colonies. And corregidors were mostly like these municipal or local type courts that they had. They were under the audiencias. So it's like a lower court and an upper court. They also have what they call the cabildo. I don't know if you know that. May have been to New Orleans and seen the cabildo building. But the cabildo was like the colonial government that ran the colony. It involved the viceroy and the court systems and so on. So it's where basically they ran the actual government. It was actually usually, the building was actually what they called it, where they met. Most of the officials that ran pretty much the Spain's New World, a lot of them were from what they call people born in Spain, which are called a peninsular. They're from like the Iberian Peninsula of Spain. So they were native-born Europeans who had control of everything. And people that were like, you saw in that video, who were a mix of some other group or whatever, racial-wise, didn't have a whole lot of power. So all the power flowed from Spain, from the king, and he appointed all the officials and all that ran all the governments. Now, they had the caste system, which you saw the video, or they call it I think they call it the Sistemas de Castas, which was the Spanish name that they dubbed it. It was like this social class system of races or mixed races that made up mostly Spanish America. It was something that the Spanish developed in the 1500s after they arrived, because after the Spanish came, they began to see the fact that there was all these different peoples that were there throughout the Americas. And so they began to differentiate them between the different races and classes. So at the top, you had people that were mostly European-based, who were, born in Spain or born in America as Spanish. Peninsulars were Spanish that were born in Spain. That would be like Hernan Cortez and Pizarro that we talked about before. Those are all peninsulars that were born in Spain and came to the New World. Criollo or Creoles, which of course is the English name I guess they use now, are basically mostly Spanish descent that were born in the Americas. It could be some other French or Portuguese, whatever, but they're mostly Europeans that are born in the Americas predominantly. Although sometimes they can be a mix. I know, like you may have heard of that, like African Creole and things like that. But we're talking about mostly in like the Spanish Empire. They were considered Europeans that were born in America. And they usually didn't have as much power, believe it or not, the Creoles, as much as the Spanish-born people that were from Spain. So later, they don't really start classifying mestizos until probably the 1600s, like 17th century. So just wasn't that many of them at first. But eventually they have what they call a mestizo. Just mestizo is a mix of like someone who was Spanish and someone who was like Native American Indian, is what it is. And there's different degrees of it. You see all the different pictures they have in here. I think they talk about in the video, you could be 3/4 Spanish, 1/4, Indian. The more Spanish you were, the better off you were, of course. And they had those that were Indian. Indians were considered like on the bottom, like Native Americans. I'll get to it later. The Indians were treated kind of poorly, if you know about it. A lot of them died under the Spanish throughout their empire because they were used as like slave labor. Also, of course, Africans were brought in too as well. That should be African slave, I don't know the type of there. But Africans were brought in too from Africa as well to replace Indian slavery. And so they were considered also more toward the bottom as well because they weren't Spanish. Then mulatto could be a mix. You could be a mix of Spanish and African. The more Spanish you were, like say if you were 3/4 Spanish, 1/4 black, you were better off than someone that was 3/4 black and one for Spanish. It's kind of weird, but that's what it was. So the more Spanish you were, the more, higher up you were in the caste system and all that. Oh, they have also what they call it's not in there, but there was some of the Spanish and the Portuguese have another term. You ever heard of Zambo or Sambo? Usually Z-A-M-B-O, I think is how they say it. Zambo. The Zambo was someone who was a mix of African and Indian. There was different degrees of that too, as well. Of course, in in India, they have that same thing, the caste system you've probably heard of overall, which is kind of like similar to that. But of course, the word caste is different translations of it. Like I know in Latin, caste can mean pure, but in Spanish, caste meant more like lineage, what your lineage was. And so when you were born and you were baptized, they would usually register you, whatever your race was. And so that obviously influenced, your whole life, after that within the empire of the Spanish. Now, of course, one of the things that happened, if you know about it, was because of all these Indians that were, in Native America and all that, they had what they call the encomienda system was developed. I don't know if you know much about it. And I think it's right here mentioned. I don't know where if it's in here or not about the encomienda. I don't think it's there. But the encomienda system was this slave labor system that they developed throughout Spanish America. And so when the Spanish came as colonists, they could get so much land and so many Native Americans, which they were kind of given in charge of taking care of them. And so, of course, they would be converted to Catholicism. That was one of the main things that the Spanish crown wanted to do, was to convert all the Native Americans to Catholicism. And then in return, they would have to give like labor tribute to the Spanish crown. What happened was it was kind of like corrupted, if you know about it. And the encomienda system basically became more like a slave system, and it led to a lot of Indian slaves or Indians dying under the Spanish, which they don't know the exact number, but it could have been in the millions. They were used the Native Americans were used in mining, they're used on plantations, and so on. And a lot of them also died of disease, a combination of slavery and disease. And there was a famous Spanish priest and missionary. He was also a writer. His name was Bartholomew de las Casas. He was one of the first Spanish to kind of speak out about the whole encomienda system. And he has a nickname. They called him the Protector of the Indians. And he had gone to the New World. In fact, he had been an encomienda. Yeah, he had been an encomienda. They call it encomiendero, I think is what they call it when you got land and Indian slaves. And he wrote a book about it. It was called The Brief Account of the Devastation of the Indies. And he saw how in the Caribbean, the fact that the Spanish policies had wiped out most of the Native Americans there within a 50-year period after Columbus came in 1492. Said 1492 is kind of when it started, and all of that. And so he went to Spain. I don't know if you know this or not, but he helped pass these laws. They were called the New Laws of 1542. And what it did was it eventually eliminated slave labor of Indians within a generation. After I think they died, they wouldn't have it anymore. And however, what happened, if you know about it, was Las Casas, I think, wrote a letter to King Charles, who was the King of France, and he said that basically what they ought to do is replace Indian slavery with African slavery, and that's why the Spanish started importing African slaves. into Latin America, and that's where most of Africans end up in the New World. Majority of them, especially in South America. I think Brazil's got the most African people of descent that's actually there. Yeah, the Portuguese would do the same thing. Portuguese, of course, also used slaves as well. And the Portuguese used slaves mostly on like sugar plantations predominantly. And so would the Spanish. The Spanish used them a lot on plantations like in the Caribbean, and then also on plantations and haciendas, which were these large-size estates that sprang up all over Latin America later. Also, they were used for like a lot of people, like African slaves especially. Of course, originally Indian slaves were used a lot in silver mining, which was big in Spain, in Spanish America. And if you were a mine owner and you had to, mine for silver, gold, whatever it was. I know in Peru, silver mining was real big. They found a lot of silver in the Andes Mountains. And so a lot of Indian slaves, I know, originally died a lot in mining, like especially in the early 1600s, like by the thousands, they think. And so if you were mining, you had to pay a certain amount to the monarch, the Spanish monarch, the king. And it was called they call it different names, but they usually call it you can see it on the bottom there, but it's the Quinto Real, which in Spanish, that means the royal fifth, or Quinto del Rey, which means the king's fifth. So you had to pay 20%. That's how much that is, 1/5. Do the math on it. It's 20%. You had to pay 20% of tax on whatever you mined. It didn't matter what it was you're mining, silver, whatever. And I think later they increased it to 25%. That's about kind of what people pay in tax, I guess, now, so that's why, like, later the Spanish started building these huge multi-deck ships you may have heard of, which are the Spanish galleons. And they start shipping back all these gold and silver bars back to Spain. And of course, there's numerous cases where a lot of these ships shipwrecked, like around the Americas, Caribbean, off the Atlantic, and they're still finding them. These treasure ships, that they call them, which is worth millions. Like if you find any and all that today. So anyway, like I said, the Spanish were in the New World till the early 1800s, and what happened was because of Napoleon Bonaparte taking over Spain and Portugal, the colonists all revolted, and they eventually overthrew the Spanish rule. They created their own separate states. So all those areas in Latin America you were looking at in this picture, all these different countries emerged, like Mexico's here. You got all these Central American countries that'll eventually break away, like Nicaragua, Guatemala, and so on, Panama, Costa Rica. You got in South America, you've got Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Argentina, Chile, Peru, also Paraguay, Uruguay. I think those are the main ones that all are created. And all those are from the former Spanish colonies in Latin America. They'll form in the 18th century later. All right, let me move on to the study guide real quick, and then I'm going to, of course, move on to talk about the Age of Absolutism a little bit today. Now, of course, a few questions kind of go back and talk about the conquest of America. Who was Hernan Cortez? What was he famous for? Cortez was, of course, a famous conquistador that conquered Mexico and destroyed the Aztec Empire. And that's pretty much what he was famous for, which the Aztec Empire fell in 1521. What was the Aztec Empire? It was a Mesoamerican, Native American state that was in central Mexico, and it was ruled by a people that were called the Mexica. Well, the Spanish called them Aztec. and they were located where Mexico City was, like in that area in central Mexico. Their capital was called Tenochtitlan, which Cortez eventually conquered and destroyed. What emperor did Cortez meet who believed he was the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl? That was Emperor Montezuma, also sometimes called Moctezuma if you want. Montezuma or Montezuma II. He was one of their last emperors that ruled over the Aztecs. What city was laid siege to and destroyed by Cortez? Tenochtitlan. And Cortez was the one that built Mexico City on top of the old Aztec Tenochtitlan. That became the capital of New Spain and later Mexico. Who was La Malinche? It's kind of out of order. Donna Marine. She's called different names. She was this slave girl. Actually, was a Mayan slave girl of Cortez, and she was also his lover. And then, of course, most importantly, she was his translator. Helped translate the Aztec language, Nahuatl, and she helped Cortez conquer Mexico. That's why she's kind of hated and villainized sometimes today. Who was Francisco Pizarro? Pizarro was Spanish conquistador who eventually came to the Americas, and he conquered what is Peru and the Inca Empire. What was the Inca Empire? The Inca Empire was a Native American empire that was in the Andes Mountains in what is Peru. It also went down, I think, into Chile, but mostly in Peru. And its capital was Cusco. They were ruled by these rulers called Inca. Who was the Inca emperor that Pizarro captured his invasion of Peru? That was in 1532. That was, of course, Atahualpa. And Atahualpa was seized from his throne, and he took control of the empire. And he forced Atahualpa to pay a huge ransom in millions worth of dollars of gold and silver, which he filled in 2 huge rooms. And Pizarro turned around and had him killed to take control. Who was Manco? Sometimes called different names. Manco Inca. Sometimes called Manco II sometimes. And Manco was a puppet ruler that Pizarro put in power after he killed Atahualpa. And Manco rebelled against him, like in 1536, and fled Peru to the jungles of northern Peru. And Manco was the one that founded that neo-Inca state that was based around a capital that was called Vilcabamba. And Vilcabamba was known as the lost city of the Incas, which wasn't later found until like early 1900s. Of course, we just talked about this real quick here, but what 2 main viceroys were created by the Spanish after the initial conquest? Yeah, the initial ones they founded first were New Spain, where Mexico is, and part of North America, and Peru. And you saw the other 2 they founded too, which were New Granada and then the Rio de la Plata, which they added later. That wasn't until like the 1700s when they kind of broke those areas up. The other areas were just too big. That's what it was. What different social class other groups emerged in Latin America after that? They call it the caste system or sistema de castas. It's a social class system based on racial groups, basically. And was broken up into different groups based on their racial background. So those that were considered European were either peninsulars, which were Spanish-born people like Cortez, etc. And then Creoles were Spanish people that were born in the Americas. They're called a Creole, Creoles. Mestizos were like a mix, right? They were a mix of either like European and Indian. It's depending on what the mixture was. So there's different kinds of mestizos. So they're a mix of European and Indian. Who was on the bottom? Usually Indians were. They were considered the lowest on the bottom. Above them, like Africans, and then you have your mix of African and like European. The income unit was this slave labor system that the Spanish developed in the 16th century. And what it did was it used the Indians as slaves, as like a form of tribute to the crown. But the Spanish kind of corrupted the system, and they killed off a lot of Indians due to the tough labor that they had to do, and also because of diseases, European diseases that killed them off. Bartholomew de las Casas, he was the Spanish priest that helped get it banned. He actually met with the King of Spain to debate, Indian human rights. And it led to the new laws of 1542, which eventually banned Indian slavery in Spanish America within a generation. Real audiencia was some of the main royal court systems that were in Spanish America. They're also in the other colonies. And the real audiencia, or just audiencias, were the main courts that ran the state with the viceroy. It was kind of like the governor who ruled in the king's name. Quinto real was a term I told you, which meant the royal fifth, or they also said the king's fifth as well. The royal fifth was a tax on minerals, like mining, mineral rights or mining, where you had to pay 20% tax to the royal crown. So that's basically the stuff on the whole New World. Right, so I've got a few minutes left. I'm going to go ahead, of course, move on to talk about the Age of Absolutism. That, of course, is the next period in American history that we have. So Qlee's here. Hey, good morning. I didn't see that one, but hey, anybody else want to join me? You can come into StreamYard right now if you want. But anyway, I guess we're talking about, of course, the next thing, the Age of Absolutism. And of course, if you know about the Age of Absolutism, it was a period in early modern European history where the power of the throne was in control of these kings or queens that had total power, total control over the state, like the government, total control over society in general. There was no constitution, really. They didn't really have what we call a constitutional monarchy. The monarch was like the law of the land. So whatever the king, like if he issued like an edict or something like that, that was considered what the law would be, basically. So the king was in total control over everything. And a lot of it had to do with like the connection with like religion, especially in a lot of the states, and most of the states in Europe that were predominantly absolute were mostly the Catholic ones, but some were not, like in Prussia and Russia. So, but they were at one point absolute. Of course, there's different theories on, its influences. Predominantly, you can see it peaks. Those are the right dates there, it should be, but actually it peaks around the 1600s. It really starts back in the 1500s. You can go all the way back to really the time of like Charles. Emperor Charles V was considered one of the most absolute rulers in Europe in the 1500s. But it peaks really, I guess, in the 1600s up to like the mid to late 1700s, roughly. And then because of the French Revolution and other various revolutions in Europe, Napoleon and so on, a lot of it began to decline. Absolutism. And then you had the Age of Enlightenment that came into that. Those are the two big things. French Revolution, Age of Enlightenment really helped to end it later as a whole. There's different writers that influenced like the Age of Absolutism. There's one I think I've got here, which is Thomas Hobbes. He wrote a book in 1651 that was called Leviathan, which the term Leviathan, I don't know if you know what a Leviathan, it's a sea monster. The idea of this came from like the Bible. And Hobbes was an English philosopher who lived in the 17th century. He was heavily influenced by the English Civil War, which we'll talk about later, and King Charles I, who was executed at the end of it. And he was concerned about, rulers getting overthrown. And so he argued that natural law made absolute monarchy the best form of government. He said that the reason why was that humans were natural, selfish, and violent. And so they need to have some king who was in direct control. And a lot of people couldn't make their own decisions, which is true, because back in those days, very few people were educated. So it's hard for people like that to really run government and things like that, unless they're not educated and so on. And so he wanted a strong ruler in power. And so Hobbes was heavily influenced on that idea, especially in like continental Europe. There's a lot of people that were heavily influenced by it as a whole. Let's see here. They also had the great chain of being, which I'll get to in a second about that. But let me see where it is I talk about, not here, but in this slide. They also have what they call divine right, or also called divine right of kings. Divine right of kings is one of the main belief that really runs absolutism and how it works. The belief is that God created the monarchy, that the monarch acted as God's representative on earth. So basically, the king was considered the highest mortal that represented God in religion. The absolute monarch answered only to God, not to his subjects. So this is a belief that went back centuries, influenced by the Bible, probably influenced by the Roman Empire as well. The Bible was definitely a big one to know, because like people kind of view like King David and King Solomon as all these powerful, kings that were in power, that were, practically ordained by God in a sense. The great chain of being has often been a medieval ideal or influence that's created this hierarchy where the king became the highest representative on earth. So, you got God and his angels and everything that's in heaven and so on, with like the stars and the moon and all of that. And then you can see how the king is the highest. So the king is the highest authority, followed by the church, followed by the nobility, and followed by like your common man. And then all the animals, you can see here, plants, minerals, rocks and things like that are on the bottom. So that's basically a theory that it's a big influence on divine right overall. Now, there's another guy. I don't know if I have a picture of Jacques Bousset or not. Let me try to think if I had him or not. I think I do. I don't know if I have him. Jacques Bousset. I thought I did. There he is. Maybe he's right there. There he is. Jacques Bousset. He was kind of influential too, as well in divine right theory. He was a bishop under Louis XIV. He was king of France, and he heavily influenced theories of divine right in France, especially with the Bourbon dynasty. And so he's considered another influence also on absolutism in modern Europe that influenced other people. So he argued the same thing, that the king was God's representative on earth and was entitled to unquestioned obedience because of it. So there was an old saying about the king. What was it? He can bless you, he can caress you, or he can strike you. Those are three things that a king could do, like under absolutism. And I think sometimes in France, they have this symbol where you'll see a scepter and it's got three fingers on it, like a three-fingered scepter. I think they call it. I think they call it the hand of justice or something like that. And that's the three things that a king can do: caress you, bless you, or he can strike you. So, all right. Go on to this slide here. Examples of major parts that make up absolutism. It's despotic. That's one thing. I guess, of course, it gives kind of a bad name to absolutism. Is that all the rulers are despotic. A lot of them were, And so the king wanted to have you killed or whatever, and put you in prison like the man in the iron mask or something like that. He could literally have it done. Just say the word, pretty much, and throw you in prison for no reason at all. So that's definitely true. Autocratic for sure, because a lot of these kings practically micromanaged, their thrones. The most famous example is Louis XIV. He had various advisors, ministers, but pretty much the craft of state, and all that was controlled directly by him. So there's a lot of micromanaging of the state. Same thing under Maria Theresa, who ruled over Austria and all that. Habsburg Empire was like that too. She had a bunch of advisors, but she pretty much was the last word. But it's still bureaucratic. That's the only thing. That's why Age of Absolutism, or the term absolutism, is kind of some say it's a myth, because you can't really be totally absolutist, because you still got to have people run the government, like ministers and advisors. And so it's still bureaucratic, like any other kind of government, whether it's a republic or constitutional monarchy, it's all going to be bureaucratic as a whole. Now, examples of countries that are considered, absolute. The big ones, of course, I mentioned earlier. We'll talk about France and Austria, of course, are the ones we'll talk about first, that were considered, absolutist. Also, you can throw in there too. Prussia was absolutist. Russia was like that. Sweden was too, believe it or not. Sweden kind of had absolute monarchs for a while. Spain, of course, had something like that, especially Charles, King Charles or Emperor Charles V was pretty absolute as a ruler. So those are the main ones that were considered kind of like absolutist that were in Europe, at the time. Now, one of the first states that really, starts, creating absolutism is, of course, the French Bourbon dynasty, which will rule over France for a couple hundred years. And the Bourbon dynasty of France was in power from 1589 to 1830. So that's a period of, like, you can see 200 something years. However, there's a gap in there. I don't know if you know that or not. There's a gap in there where they had the French Revolution, where there's no king, because they kill off Louis XVI for a while there, kill him off. And then Napoleon comes in, and he rules to like 1814, 1815. So there's a period where 20-something years where they're not in power. Suppose, of course, the first Bourbon king of France, who we've talked about before, is Henry IV, who was originally called Henry of Navarre. Henry IV came to power in 1589. I remember we were talking about Catherine de Medici, and she had all those sons that were kings, like 3 of them that were kings. They had no children that could get the throne. Like, I guess no sons. I don't think any daughters that were legitimate either that could get the throne. And so it went to Henry. And Henry was descended from this so-called Bourbon family, or they really pronounce it Bourbon. But the Bourbon family went back to the Middle Ages. In fact, their original founder of the Bourbons went back to the 1300s. A man named Louis I, who they call the Duke of Bourbon, hence the name. The Bourbons were like a cadet branch of what they call the Capetian dynasty. Capetian dynasty was the what they call the actual original dynasty of France that went back to the Middle Ages, like the early part of the Middle Ages. And so they kind of broke off from it, and they were kind of like a royal nobility type family that was part of the Capetian line. There's other ones like the Orleans that broke off from it. And then they also had the one called the Valois, which is what the ones of Catherine de Medici's sons were. So he was the first Bourbon king. One thing about Henry was originally a Huguenot, like a lot of French nobility were. He was a Calvinist, Protestant, basically. And he was involved like in the French wars of religion at that time. He was kind of on the opposing side, but he eventually converted Catholicism to gain power in 1589. We've already talked about Henry IV, but he was the one that issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which I told you gave Huguenots, which were French Calvinists, freedom of worship throughout the country. They even had a right to build their own churches, have their own Protestant schools, and even some of their own Protestant like cities or whatever they could actually rule from politically. So Henry's important. He helped to unify the state. They think absolutism kind of starts to take off at that point, but not quite. Then the ruler they think that really absolutism starts under is really the second Bourbon king that came in, who was the son of Henry IV, who was called Louis XIII, who you can see reigned for about 33 years. Louis came to the throne at age 8. Well, by the way, what happened to Henry? Henry was assassinated apparently in 1610 by some kind of Catholic fanatic. I don't think he liked the Edict of Nantes. I think it's what it was. But he was murdered. And so his son came in, who was only 8. And his mother, whose name was Marie de Medici, Marie de Medici was a cousin of Catherine de Medici, and she was the wife of King Henry IV. She heavily influenced his reign early on, up into like his early 20s. And when he was about, I think he was about 23, he made Louis XIII appoint France's first chief minister of France, who was Cardinal Richelieu. We've got a slide on Richelieu here. And his real name is Armand Jean Duplessis, Duc de Richelieu, which means the Duke of Richelieu. And of course, he was the chief minister of France. The years that he was in power, if you want to know, was from 1624 was when he was appointed. It's right here, actually. And he was in power till 1642. So he was in power for 18 years. And if you know about Richelieu, Richelieu is considered to be the first prime minister in history. You know, most states have a prime minister that run the government and the parliament. Well, he was considered the first one in history before the English had one, like the British. British have a prime minister later, but it's not developed until the early 1700s. So he was considered the first chief minister or prime minister. And Richelieu was important because he heavily influenced a lot of policies that were under Louis XIII, most of them dealing with absolutism. And some of the main things he did was he influenced the foreign and domestic policies of the country. I'm trying to think if I had a slide on him. I don't think I do have a slide on Richelieu. I don't think I do. But I don't think I had. I got Louis XIV, but for some reason I don't have him for some reason. But I'll kind of talk briefly about what were some of the policies of Richelieu. One of the big things that Richelieu did, which I can add on the screen for you, is that Richelieu supported the enemies of the Habsburg Empire. In the 30 Years' War, I don't know if you remember correctly, we had talked about the 30 Years' War. And what happened was, of course, you remember in Germany that the war broke out between the Catholics and the Protestants. Well, Richelieu and Louis XIII were kind of fearful that what would happen was that the French Empire would get surrounded by Habsburg territories. And so the French, starting in mostly the 1630s, began supporting a lot of the Protestant states in the north, Prussia, Dutch, etc., also the Swedes. And so that led to eventually, one of the things that happened because of that was that it led to France. Then France became, later the major power in Europe. After he went out of power, Richelieu and Louis XIII, after he died, France became the big power in Europe after the 30 Years' War because of a lot of the policies of Richelieu under him. Richelieu also, one of the things he did too was he centralized the crown around the king's power, basically. And what he did was he took power from the nobility and he gave to the king. And the way they did that was they took like the nobility couldn't have any more of their own personal armies. They couldn't have castles or anything like that. So only the monarch could have control of these things with the state. And so that was a way he was able to centralize a lot of the power. And eventually they'll exempt some of the nobility from taxation, like especially by the time of Louis XIV, they start doing that. That gives the king more power to like micromanage, everything in general. Oh, I forgot another thing he did, which was very famous. He founded the Académie Française, which I'll put the year up. It was founded in the year 1635. I don't know if you ever heard of the Académie Française. It's also called the French Academy. It's this council of the French, which controls like the French language and its use. They developed like the French dictionaries, also the use of French in anything, whether it be like arts, culture, math, science, whatever. And it's something he founded in the 1630s, which helped, expand French culture and things like that. You may have heard of Richelieu and all that. He's been in like a lot of novels. You may have heard about the Three Musketeers, the story about that. He's kind of like a character is kind of in that. It's around that same time, early 1600s is when mostly Richelieu lived at the time. So Richelieu's important. Richelieu is really the man that really starts absolutism. He even appointed his successor, who we'll talk about later, whose name is Cardinal Jules Mazarin. And both him and Richelieu were cardinals in the Catholic Church. That's why he was called the Red Eminence. You see that nickname on the bottom because he wore the red dress of a cardinal. Very powerful figure, heavily influential, of course, on other rulers later, like Louis XIV and so on. And then Louis XIV is going to come in. He's going to be the peak absolutist that the French are going to have pretty much in the country. So that's the next thing, of course, I'll be talking about is, of course, the advent of Louis XIV, who comes in power, who's known as the Sun King, which probably won't lecture on him today because it's going to take a while to cover him. You see, I've got a few minutes left here. I probably could go ahead and review whatever I covered today. I guess I could do that real quick, and we'll just get that out the way. And I'll talk about a few announcements before I go. So quickly, we had just talked about, I'll talk about this slide real quick here, but what is absolutism? What main centuries does it mostly dominate? Absolutism was a period where the European state monarchs had absolute central control over their state. There was no constitutional monarchy or constitution that ran the state. So everything was micromanaged with him or her and his like advisors, some ministers. Mostly it peaks in the 1700s, which would be 17th, 18th centuries, but it does start kind of like in the 16th century, going back to like Emperor Charles V as examples. Influences on it, I told you, like it was influenced by books like Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan was a big influence, I know, on it. The Bible and Catholicism, religion, of course, was a big influence. I told you about that theory about the great chain of being. That was a big influence. I guess you could throw in there if you want Machiavellian politics and things like that were kind of something you could throw in if you want. What political theory dominated absolutism? Divine right of kings or divine right theory on politics, where it was believed that God had given the kings or queens the right to rule, and that no one else had any power. So a lot of it was connected to politics and religion, especially with the Catholic faith. What European nations developed it predominantly? I told you the main ones that were famous were France, Prussia, Russia, Austria, and also I told you Sweden, Spain. I think at one point kind of were absolute for a while as well. Who was the founder of the Bourbon dynasty? King Henry IV, known as Henry of Navarre. He was the one who passed the Edict of Nantes, so he was considered the first Bourbon ruler that ruled over the French Bourbon dynasty that reigned until 1830. Cardinal Richelieu, of course, was a chief minister under King Louis XIII. They believe he was the one that started really the major influence on French absolutism in the country. He centralized the power of the throne around the king rather than the nobility, which I told you gave examples of that. And then a lot of his policies, of course, made France into a world power. Like by the end of the 17th century, under Louis XIV, France is the most powerful country in the world. A lot of the policies dealt with the fact that they try to centralize around the throne and the empire. And I told you how he had supported like the Protestant side in the 30 Years' War and all that. Also, Richelieu also expanded a lot of the empire, like to develop Canada, like what they call New France, something he did. And also colonies like in India, in the Caribbean, which I'll kind of talk about later when I get to Louis XIV. So anyway, I think that's it. I think we'll get to Louis XIV, of course, later. And on Tuesday's class next week, I'll continue talking about the Age of Absolutism. And just want to remind before we go that don't forget, I did post new assignments that you've got to complete by I think it's next Tuesday, which is September 15th. So you got, that new assignment I posted on the Hernan Cortez documentary by Michael Wood. So try to get that done. And that's worth 50 points. And then the other Canvas quiz, of course, is the one that's on exploration, the Age of Discovery. That one's due also next Tuesday, the September the 15th. That one's worth 100 points. So you got two assignments coming up that you got. And don't forget, if you have not completed the Canvas quiz on the Reformation, I think there was only one student that hadn't done it for some reason. I don't know why. But that person needs to get it done and get that completed. That'd be great if we could all get it. Ooh, yeah, everybody get it done. That'd be awesome. I think ever get that happen on the first one. That's good. But hopefully they do that one. But and I'll talk about more next week about our upcoming first exam. But like I said, next week, starting on September 15th, Tuesday, you can go ahead and start turning in your vocab if you haven't already done it already. Some of you may have done it early, but you can start turning in that first vocab. I'll try to get up the new one probably next week sometime. So that's it for today's lecture. If you haven't seen it today yet, go ahead and watch the lecture on YouTube. And don't forget, send me comments, questions about the lecture today. Remember, you get bonus points for that, or you can if you want. So just send me comments, questions, and I will see you, of course, next week. So y'all have a good weekend, and y'all take care.